I learned something about war far too late. The moments that follow you home are rarely the loud ones. They're the quiet decisions, the ones you make without witnesses, the ones you explain away because there isn't time to think, because someone higher than you told you to move, or because stopping felt more dangerous than going on. I am writing this now because I am old, and the nights have grown longer than the days, because the people who might have remembered me as I was are mostly gone, and because there is one decision I made during the winter of 1944 that I have never found a clean way to live with. I won't use my real name, not because I'm afraid of being found out, but because this isn't about reputation. It's about memory. And memory doesn't care what name you sign at the bottom. At the time, I was an infantryman in Europe. Not a hero. Not a coward either. At least not in the ways people imagine. I did what I was told. I kept my rifle clean. I learned how to sleep sitting up, how to eat fast, how to ignore the sound of men coughing in the dark. We were cold most of the time, cold in a way that sank into your bones and stayed there, even when you stood near a fire. There is a smell I still remember from those months, wet wool and old smoke. It clings to everything in my mind when I think back. My boots were always damp. I can picture them even now, cracked leather, laces frayed, the left sole worn thinner than the right. I carried a letter from home, folded inside one of them, tucked between the lining and my sock. I told myself it was for luck. The truth is, I needed something solid to remind me I had once belonged somewhere else. The decision I'm talking about didn't feel important at the time. That's the part that frightens me most. Even now, it wasn't made in anger. It wasn't made under fire. It was made during a pause. A stretch of waiting so ordinary that it blended into the days around it. There was an order. Orders always sound clean when people repeat them years later. This one was brief, practical, and spoken by a man who hadn't slept any more than the rest of us. We were to move on, leave the area, regroup before nightfall. I remember looking back once. Just once. I remember thinking that someone else would handle what we were leaving behind. Someone always does, you tell yourself. Or at least you hope they will. At the time, I didn't realize what that choice would cost. There's one part of this that I avoided remembering for years. I told myself the memory was unreliable. That age had rearranged it, softened it, or made it worse than it really was. But the truth has a way of staying sharp, no matter how carefully you wrap it. I had a friend then. I'll call him Eddie. That wasn't his name, but it's close enough. He was younger than me by a few years, talked about his mother's cooking as if he could still smell it. He had a habit of checking his watch even when there was nowhere to be, and no reason to hurry. He asked me quietly if we were doing the right thing. I didn't answer him. That silence is part of what I'm confessing now. Only later did I understand what we had really done. If you're still reading, I need you to know this isn't going where you think it is. Not yet. The moment itself is simple. The weight of it took decades to arrive. I'm telling this now because time is running out, and because some truths don't surface until there's almost nothing left to lose. But before I can explain what happened next, I have to tell you what that winter was like, and why walking away felt easier than staying. That winter settled into us like an illness. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow weakening. The days blurred together, marked only by meals when they came and orders when they changed. We waited more than we fought. People don't talk much about the waiting, but that's where most of the fear lies. In the pauses, in the hours when nothing happens, and your mind starts filling the space on its own. We were quartered near a small village then. Not much more than a handful of stone buildings and a road that led somewhere none of us could point to on a map. The fighting had moved past it, or so we were told. That phrase moved past. Did a lot of work during the war. It let you believe danger had a direction. Forward, IG, away from you. Our days followed a pattern. Wake before dawn. Check gear. Stand around pretending to be busy so we wouldn't have to think. Someone always complained about their feet. Someone always said the war would be over by summer, even when it was already winter. Eddie kept checking his watch, as if time might suddenly behave itself if he watched closely enough. There was a sound that stayed with me from that place, a loose shutter banging against stone whenever the wind picked up. It didn't matter how far away you were. You could hear it. Bang, dotty. Pause. Bang, dot. At night, it was worse. Every noise sounded like it was meant for you. We were told not to interact with civilians unless necessary. That was another clean sentence people liked to repeat. Unless necessary. No one ever explained what counted. Most of us took it to mean, don't get attached, don't ask questions, don't create problems someone else will have to solve. There was a house near the edge of the village that I noticed because it smelled different. Not smoke or damp wool, but something warmer. Cooked food. Maybe bread. I remember thinking how unfair it was that a smell could make you feel almost human again. Eddie noticed it too. He said it reminded him of Sundays. At the time, I didn't realize how closely I was paying attention to that place. We received the order to move on in the late afternoon. It came down the line without ceremony. No explanation, no discussion. Just a direction and a time. The sun was already low. The sky the color it gets before snow. When everything feels suspended, I remember tightening the straps on my pack and feeling relieved. Movement meant purpose. Purpose meant less thinking. Eddie didn't look relieved. He hesitated, just for a second, and glanced toward that house. There's still, he started and stopped himself. I didn't ask him to finish the sentence. I was afraid of what it might require from me if he did. There's a temptation when you're young to believe that responsibility belongs to whoever speaks the loudest, the man giving the order, the officer with the map. If you're quiet, if you simply follow, you can tell yourself the weight isn't yours to carry. Only later did I understand how heavy silence can be. As we formed up to leave, the shutter kept banging in the wind. Bang, dotty yell. Pause. Bang, dotty. On a wind show. It felt like a clock counting something down, though I didn't know what yet. Eddie leaned toward me and asked, almost under his breath, "Do you think someone else will take care of it?" I told him yes. Or maybe I just nodded. I've replayed that moment so many times that the exact shape of my answer has worn thin. What matters is that I didn't stop. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't do the one thing that might have changed what came after. At the time, I believed moving on was the safer choice. There's a part of this I avoided remembering for years. What I felt as we walked away. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was relief. And that, more than anything else, is what still troubles me. We marched as the light faded, boots crunching over frozen ground, breath hanging in front of our faces like smoke that refused to drift away. No one spoke much. That usually meant everyone was thinking the same thing, but didn't want to be the first to say it. Or worse, didn't want to hear it said out loud. The village disappeared behind a bend in the road sooner than I expected. One moment, the stone roofs were still visible, low and gray against the sky. And the next, they were gone. Just trees and snow, and that long, narrow road stretching forward. I remember being surprised by how quickly a place could stop existing. At the time, I told myself that was the point. You leave things behind because you have to. Because if you carried every place with you, you'd never move at all. We bivouacked that night in a shallow wooded area. No tents, just blankets, if you had one dry enough to matter. Someone managed a small fire, shielded carefully so it couldn't be seen from a distance. The heat barely reached my hands, but I held them there anyway. It felt like proof that we were still alive. Eddie sat across from me, rubbing his fingers together, his watch catching the firelight every time he moved. He kept glancing up as if expecting someone to call us back, or maybe hoping they would. Neither happened. There's something about nighttime in war that changes the shape of your thoughts. During the day, everything feels practical. You're too busy staying upright to imagine consequences. At night, memory creeps in. So does doubt. Eddie finally spoke. He said he didn't like how quiet it had been back there. Not the good quiet, the kind that feels emptied out. I told him he was tired, that we all were. It was easier than agreeing. At the time, I said, trying to sound certain, we did what we were supposed to do. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He turned his watch face down against his wrist, as if he didn't want to see the time anymore. I slept badly. When I did drift off, I dreamed of that shutter banging in the wind, only now it sounded closer, louder, like someone knocking without using their hands. I woke up with my heart racing and couldn't remember why. Just that something had been left unfinished. Only later did I understand why that feeling stayed with me. The next morning, we were given new orders and a new direction. War has a way of stacking instructions so quickly that yesterday's choices start to feel irrelevant. That's another trick it plays on you. If you keep moving, you don't have to look back. But I did look back. Not with my eyes. The road behind us was already gone, but with my mind. I kept thinking about Eddie's question, about my answer, about how easily I had accepted that someone else would handle it. There's one detail I haven't mentioned yet. I don't know why I avoided it for so long. Maybe because it makes the decision harder to excuse. Before we left that village, I heard something that didn't fit. Not gunfire, not shouting. A sound small enough to be ignored if you wanted to. I wanted to. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to interpret it. I told myself a lot of things, and for a long time, those explanations were enough. They stopped being enough the day we passed back through that area again. We came back 2 days later from the opposite direction. Not by plan, nothing ever felt planned that late in the winter, but because the front bent and folded in on itself the way it often did. Maps changed. Lines moved. What had been behind us suddenly wasn't. I recognized the road before I recognized the place. The curve was the same. The trees leaned in the same way. Branches bare and dark against the snow. My stomach tightened before I understood why. I told myself it was just fatigue. Everyone was tired by then. No one said the village's name. No one needed to. From a distance, it looked unchanged. Stone was still stone. Roofs still sloped the way they always had. That's another thing people don't tell you. How normal things can look after something has gone wrong. The world doesn't pause out of respect. As we drew closer, I noticed the silence first. The shutter wasn't banging anymore. The wind was still there, but the sound was gone. It felt like walking into a room where a conversation has just stopped. At the time, I didn't realize how carefully I was listening. We were ordered to sweep through quickly, check for movement. No stopping unless necessary. That word again, necessary. It followed me like a shadow. Eddie walked a few paces ahead of me. His shoulders were tight. His rifle held a little higher than usual. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was thinking about the same thing I was. There are moments when two people share a thought without ever agreeing to. As we passed the house near the edge of the village, the one with the warm smell, I slowed without meaning to. The door was closed. Nothing looked broken. Nothing obvious, anyway. That had almost made it worse. I remember thinking how easy it would be to keep walking. Only later did I understand that this was the moment that still mattered most. Someone farther up the line called out to keep moving. The order wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried the quiet authority of routine. I hesitated, just long enough to feel it. Eddie stopped. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at the door. I could see his jaw working, like he was weighing words and finding none of them sufficient. "Maybe we should check," he said finally. I felt a flash of irritation that surprised me. Not at him, at the situation, at the fact that the choice had come back to us. I told him we didn't have time, that if there was something to be done, someone would have already done it. The same logic I'd used before, repeated without much thought. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Eddie looked at me then. Really looked. Not accusing, not angry, just searching, as if he hoped I might say something different if he waited long enough. There's one part of this I avoided, remembering for years, the way I shook my head. It was a small motion, almost nothing, but it was enough. He hesitated, then stepped back into line. The moment passed. The door stayed closed. We moved on. I told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't. Because later that day, something happened that stripped away the comfort of not knowing. And once you lose that, explanations stop working the way they used to. That was the day Eddie stopped checking his watch. It happened a few hours later, after the village was behind us again, and the day had settled into that dull gray that made time feel flat. We were moving along a tree line when one of the men ahead slowed, then stopped. No signal, no command, just a change in posture that rippled backward through the column. That's how you knew something was wrong. Not by noise, but by hesitation. Someone said there was movement. Someone else said it was probably nothing. We waited, waiting again, always waiting. The cold had worked its way back into my feet, and I shifted my weight to keep the feeling from leaving them completely. Eddie stood beside me, unusually still. At the time, I didn't realize how alert he had become. The sound came again, closer this time. Not sharp, not threatening, just enough to cut through the quiet. I felt my stomach tighten in recognition, and that was when I knew I had heard it before. Back in the village, before we left. Only later did I understand why my first reaction wasn't fear, but shame. An order came down to investigate. 2 men were sent forward. Eddie volunteered before I could stop him. I remember opening my mouth, meaning to say something. I still don't know what, and closing it again. Old habits. Silence, once learned, comes easily. They found the source just beyond the trees, in a shallow dip where the snow had drifted higher. It wasn't an enemy position. It wasn't a trap. It was a person. I won't describe them in detail. That isn't the point, and it wouldn't make this truer. What matters is that they were alive, barely, and that they were alone. Eddie knelt beside them without being told. He didn't look back at me, but I could feel the question in the air between us. "Do you see now?" He didn't say. He didn't have to. The lieutenant came up behind us, took one look, and frowned. He asked where this had come from. No one answered right away. Finally, someone said the village, the same word we hadn't spoken before. There was a pause, the kind where decisions are made quickly and then defended for years afterward. The order that followed was calm, measured, practical. There were reasons given. Logistics, risk, time. The kind of reasons that sound sensible until you test them against a single human life. At the time, I told myself I understood. Eddie didn't argue. That's what surprised me most. He stood, brushed the snow from his knees, and stepped back. His face had gone blank in a way I had never seen before, as if something inside him had closed a door. The order was carried out. I didn't stop it. I didn't speak. I didn't even look away. That night, Eddie sat apart from the rest of us. His watch lay in the snow beside him, unfastened. He didn't put it back on. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for years. The moment he finally spoke to me, he said very quietly, "So that's what happens when no one checks." I didn't answer. And that silence, that second one, cost more than the first. After that day, things changed without anyone announcing it. The war went on the way it always does. Forward, sideways, sometimes backward, but something between Eddie and me had shifted out of place and never settled again. He stopped talking about home, stopped mentioning his mother's cooking Sundays, anything that existed beyond what was directly in front of us. He still did his job, better than most, if I'm being honest. But there was a distance in him that hadn't been there before, as if he'd stepped a pace to the side of himself and decided to stay there. At the time, I told myself this was normal. Men hardened. That's what people said. That's what I expected to happen eventually anyway. I didn't yet understand the difference between hardening and closing. We moved through more villages, more roads, more places that blurred together in memory. The smell of wet wool followed us everywhere. So did the cold. But now there was another sensation I couldn't shake, a pressure behind my ribs, like something unfinished pressing outward. Every so often I'd catch Eddie looking at doors as we passed them, not stopping, just looking. As if measuring the distance between choice and consequence. There's one part of this I avoided remembering for a long time. How often I thought about speaking up afterward, not in the moment. That chance was gone, but later, apologizing, explaining, saying I should have listened. Each time, I decided it was too late, that bringing it up would only reopen something better left sealed. That was my reasoning anyway. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I said the words out loud, I'd have to admit what they meant about me. Only later did I understand that silence doesn't preserve peace. It just delays the reckoning. The breaking moment came quietly. It wasn't during combat. It wasn't dramatic. We were dug in one evening, eating a thin meal that barely qualified as food. The light was fading, and the air had that stillness that comes before snow. Eddie sat across from me, turning his watch over in his hand. He hadn't worn it since that day, but he hadn't gotten rid of it either. He opened the back, something he'd never done before, and stared at the tiny moving parts as if they might explain something. "You know," he said, not looking up. "Time keeps going whether you deserve it or not." I didn't know what to say. I nodded, which had become my habit when real answers felt dangerous. He snapped the watch, shut, and stood. "I keep thinking," he added, "that if we'd just stopped, even for a minute." His voice trailed off. He shook his head, as if annoyed with himself, and walked away. That was the closest he ever came to accusing me. And somehow, that made it worse. Because accusation can be argued with. Silence cannot. A few days later, Eddie was gone. Not captured. Not transferred. Dead. I won't describe how it happened. That isn't what this is about. What matters is that when it was over, and his things were gathered, the watch was among them. Still unworn. Still keeping time. At the time, I told myself his death had nothing to do with that village, with that door, with my decision. I told myself a lot of things back then. Only later did I start to wonder whether choosing to survive is always the same as choosing to live. The war ended for me without ceremony. No clear line between danger and safety. Just an order, a ride, a long stretch of quiet that felt unreal after so much noise. I came home thinner than I'd been when I left, older than my age suggested. People said I was lucky. I let them. I carried Eddie's watch in my pocket. Not because anyone asked me to, and not because I thought it belonged to me. It was simply there when his things were sorted, and no one else claimed it. I told myself I'd give it to his family someday. That was another promise that felt easier to make than to keep. Home was patient with me in ways I didn't deserve. The streets were familiar. The food was warm. People spoke about the war as something finished, something safely behind us. I learned quickly what parts of myself to keep quiet, the parts that didn't fit the relief everyone expected. At night, I dreamed of doors. Always doors. Closed ones. Sometimes I'd wake, convinced I'd heard that same small sound again. Not a knock, not a voice. Just something asking to be noticed. My wife would stir beside me, half awake, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling until morning came. I never told her. Not really. I said enough to sound honest without being so. That's another skill I learned after the war. Years passed. I worked. I raised children. I paid my bills. From the outside, my life looked like proof that you could leave those things behind. But some memories don't fade. They settle. They wait. I took the watch out sometimes, usually late at night. It still worked. The second hand moved steadily, patient and unforgiving. Time, Eddie had said, keeps going whether you deserve it or not. I began to understand what he meant. There's one part of this I avoided, remembering until recently. The thing I finally admitted to myself when sleep stopped coming as easily. I didn't just fail to act once. I chose, again and again, not to look too closely at what that choice meant. I chose comfort over clarity, survival over responsibility. The truth I've been circling is this. The person we found later, the answer that arrived too late. They were there because of what I didn't do, not because I intended harm, not because I was cruel, but because I decided obedience was enough. I've asked myself for decades whether I could have changed anything, whether stopping, even briefly, would have altered the outcome. I don't know. That uncertainty is part of the weight. But I do know this. I never gave myself the chance to find out. As I write this now, the watch is on the table beside me. It still ticks. My hands don't shake when I hold it anymore. But the feeling hasn't gone away. It never will. There is one last thing I need to say. The part I've been avoiding since the beginning. Because the truth isn't only about what happened back there. It's about what followed me home, and why I'm finally speaking now. I'm writing this at a desk I've owned for more than 30 years. The house is quiet in a way that feels permanent now. My hands move slower than they used to, but they're steady. That matters to me. I want this to be written clearly. The truth I owe you, the one hinted at from the beginning, is simple. And that's what makes it so hard to live with. When we first left that village before the order came down, before Eddie asked his question, I understood enough to stop. I didn't know everything. I didn't know how bad it was. But I knew there was someone. I knew that the sound I heard didn't belong to the wind, or an animal, or my imagination. I recognized it for what it was, and chose to keep moving anyway. That was the decision, not later. Not when the answer arrived in the snow. Earlier, in that ordinary moment when nothing forced my hand. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I wasn't qualified, that stopping would create problems, that someone else, someone better placed, better informed, would handle it. Those were just words I used to make survival feel clean. Eddie's death wasn't punishment. I don't believe in that kind of order anymore. But his silence afterward, the way he closed himself off, showed me something I didn't want to see. That some lines, once crossed quietly, can't be stepped back over. I never gave his watch to his family. I didn't trust myself to explain why I had it. Instead, I kept it. As proof, maybe, or as a reminder that time doesn't erase responsibility. It only removes excuses. I've lived a long life, a good one, by most measures. That's part of what makes this confession necessary. I don't want my silence to be the last word. If you're wondering whether I've forgiven myself, the answer is no. But I've stopped trying to argue with the memory. I let it be what it is now. A record of a moment when fear looked like obedience, and inaction felt reasonable. Would you have done differently? I don't ask that to accuse you. I ask because war doesn't announce its moral tests. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, wrapped in orders and exhaustion. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. The cost of war isn't only counted in the dead. It's carried by the living, in the small decisions they never stop replaying. The watch is still ticking beside me as I finish this. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know this: telling the truth, even late, is lighter than carrying it alone. That's all I wanted to leave behind.